Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Sally, and today I'm going to show you how to make some delicious homemade sourdough bread. I try to keep this video as to the point as possible while still going into all the necessary detail. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Before we can do anything else, we have to feed our sourdough starter. So I've gone ahead and measured out 125 grams of warm filtered water. Bear in mind, just barely lukewarm is what you're going for. If it's too hot, it can end up killing the yeast in your sourdough starter. Then I'm gonna add 30 grams of my existing starter. I fed this last a couple days ago. I like to add it to the water first because I find it's easiest to combine. And in terms of finding a starter, you can order a starter online. That's what I did. For this one in particular, I got it from Hannah at Ballerina Farm, and it's worked really, really well for me. It came dehydrated, and I just went ahead and did the process that she outlined to hydrate the starter. You can also just get some from a friend. There is a way to make it yourself. Really, all you need for that is going to be water and flour and a nice warm space. However, I have not yet attempted that because I already have enough trouble with just the temperature of my home getting my starter to activate as is, that I think it would be a big pain in the butt to try and do it from scratch. But I've got ahead, combined 30 grams of my starter with 125 grams of water, and now we're gonna add in our flour. I just use my King Arthur all-purpose flour. It is 11.7%, so do not mix this up with other all-purpose flours. The protein, the gluten content is actually more comparable to what you're gonna find in most bread flours, which is what we need for this purpose. So I'll just clear this out. I'm adding 140 grams, if I didn't already say that, of my flour. Ultimately, I'm gonna mix it all together. I'll wash out this jar, and then I will put it in that jar in the warmest place in my house to sit for. It'll probably take about 6 hours, is about how long it usually takes to fully activate and reach its peak. Just one more note is do not skip out on the proper feeding process. For a couple years when I was first getting into sourdough bread baking, I would attempt to just add a little bit of flour, add a little bit of water to my existing jar. But you just don't see the same results. You don't see the starter getting as active, and the active, super, super happy starter is ultimately what's gonna be crucial to a successful loaf of sourdough. It's about 6.5 hours later, and our sourdough starter has well and truly doubled in size, or significantly more than that. I'd say it's about 3 times bigger than when it started. And speaking from experience, I know that if I were to leave it, this would fill up the entire jar, but I don't have time for that today. Also speaking from experience, it's been totally fine to bake with it at this stage. I still get a beautiful loaf, so that's what we're going to do. But when it comes to knowing whether or not your starter is ready, if you're ever uncertain, use a little bit of water. Just put it in a bowl, spoon some of your sourdough starter on top. If your starter floats, that's a good indication that it is ready to bake with. So that being said, we're gonna start our first step of the process. That is called our Autolyse. And I do this a little bit unconventionally. I'll explain why in a second, but first let's talk about what the Autolyse is. Traditionally, when you're doing an Autolyse, you are just combining your flour, your water, and maybe your salt, but usually the sourdough starter is going to stay out of it. This is an opportunity to start activating the gluten in that flour and developing some structure that you're going to carry all the way through to your beautiful loaf at the very end. However, after some trial and error, I ended up taking the approach that Hannah, I think her last name is Nealman, from Ballerina Farm uses. I actually watched her Instagram stories and kind of refined my sourdough process, which is where a lot of this comes from. But what she does is actually combine her starter, her flour, and part of her water, and that has just worked tremendously for me. So that's what we're going to do. A tool that I encourage everyone to invest in if you do not already have one, is a kitchen scale. When it comes to baking in general, but especially sourdough, you cannot really get consistently awesome results if you are just trying to use cups and measures, because there can be so much different volume just depending on how, or the volume can be so different depending on how tightly the flour is packed. So using this scale is super helpful. I also have a huge ceramic bowl here. We're going to combine, like I just said, the flour, the sourdough starter, and the water. As we talked about before, this is filtered water. I just heated it in my kettle about an hour ago, and I've let it sit so that it has come back down to just above room temperature. And then my flour, King Arthur, I use all purpose because I can use it in a lot of different things, and it still has a high gluten content, but their bread flour is also amazing. They are the best brand that I've found, although I know there are some others out there that work great that I just haven't used myself. To make this process as seamless as possible, I found it works best to add my starter and water first, whisk them together, and then kind of fold in the flour. So I'm gonna weigh out 150 grams of my sourdough starter. You can see how beautifully active it is by all the bubbles and all the stretch as it's coming out of the jar. Next, I'm going to add about 600 grams of water for the time being. We're gonna add additional water after our quote-unquote Autolyse, but this is it for now. Now I just like to whisk that all together. You can kind of see that this is floating on top of the water. Again, that indication that our starter is ready to use. We'll whisk this all together, and then we're gonna go ahead and add all of our flour, which is 1,000 grams. And then I like to begin just with a hard spatula. This is actually the one that came with my Instant Pot, to get this pretty loosely combined, and then I will move to my hands a little bit later in the process. But for now, our objective is just to form kind of a shaggy dough. I'm gonna cover it with a tea towel once we've gotten to that point. We're gonna let it sit for 20 to 30 minutes, and then we're gonna add the rest of our water and flour. It's 30 minutes later, so we're gonna add some kosher salt and the rest of our water. I'm adding 25 grams, if I can actually clear this out, there we go. 25 grams of kosher salt. Now I'm adding about 100 additional grams of water to reach a total of about 750 grams. I normally would add my last 150 here, 125 to 150, but I over poured initially, so here we are. You can get into hydration level a whole lot when it comes to sourdough. It's a pretty wet dough regardless, but some people argue take it up as high as 80% hydration, which is gonna mean 800 grams of water to 1,000 grams of flour, but that dough can be really difficult to work with, so I found that about 725 to 750 works really well and still gets you a really nice crumb. So now what we're gonna do is knead this all together. It can take as long as 10 minutes. I'm just using my hands. We'll knead it all together. Then we're gonna let it sit for 30 minutes, and we will begin the stretch and fold process. Take a moment here just to note kind of the consistency of the dough. It's all sticking together at this point, but it's pretty gloppy, for lack of better words. It doesn't hold together very well. It's just sticky and messy. Our stretch and fold process, which you'll see in just a moment, is gonna help us turn this dough, along with it just sitting here throughout the process, is gonna help us turn this dough from a gloppy mess into this beautiful, elastic bread dough that we're gonna bake with. So This is gonna sit for 30 minutes, and then over the next 2 hours, every 30 minutes, we're gonna do a series of stretch and folds, and we will watch that transformation happen. It's 30 minutes later and time for the first stretch and fold. So all we're gonna do is scoop under one side of the dough. It is really sticky at this point, but it will get better. We're gonna fold it over to the other side and go around to every side, just to be dividing it into 4 quadrants, doing that same thing. I like to go around 2 times. Some people only do it once, but 2 times works for me. I'll cover this back up and I will show you our other stretch and folds, and then we will talk when they are all completed. We have made it to the last round of stretch and folds. As you can see, the texture has totally transformed. Instead of being gloppy and overly sticky now, we have a beautiful elastic and just very soft, very feel-good dough here. So the stretch and folds themselves kind of make up part of the bulk fermentation because they take place over about 2 hours, but we've got at least 2 hours left in this process. So what we're gonna look for is that this dough is going to double in size and that it's gonna get a nice yeasty smell about it with lots of bubbles. You'll see on the other side of the bulk fermentation, but this is where the dough is gonna develop most of its flavor. It's late enough in the day at this point that I'm running out of sunlight, so what I'm gonna do is leave the dough out on the counter for about 2 hours, maybe an hour and a half, and then I'm just gonna cover it up and put it in the refrigerator to continue fermenting overnight. We will check back in tomorrow after I get off work and continue the process. And this is one way you can do it, but also you can just leave the dough out on the counter till it's about doubled in size, and then continue from there without refrigerating it. Really just depends on your timeline. It's the next day and it is time to go ahead and shape our loaves. So I've pulled our dough out of the refrigerator. As you can see, it's definitely increased in volume. It's kind of stiff from the fridge, but we have some bubbles in here. Overall, it's looking really nice. I have a tool here which isn't necessary, but which I find super helpful, and that's just my bench scraper. I got this one off Amazon for probably $6 or $8. What we're gonna do is empty this out onto the counter. I'm going to divide it into 2 different pieces, and then we're gonna go ahead and pre-shape our loaves. This whole process is meant to help develop surface tension so that we get a beautiful loaf of bread and prepare us for our second proof. Now that our dough is divided about evenly, I'm gonna set one loaf or one piece of it to the side for the time being. I'm going to grab the other, and our first order of business, ooh, it's chilly, is to kind of flatten the dough out like a very thick pizza. You don't need to stretch it too far, but what we want is enough area available that we can fold it in from each corner or each side. I'm doing about 5 folds here. Really, it's just gonna depend on how your dough stretches out, but we want a nice tight ball to be formed like this. Take a moment to kind of squeeze those pieces together at the bottom, and then we're gonna begin to kind of tighten up this ball before letting it bench rest for just a little bit. To continue to develop this surface tension, what we're gonna do is just grip the dough with nicely floured hands on either side, giving it a gentle push forwards and then a pull back towards us as we rotate the hands gently around the ball of dough. You can get a little bit more aggressive with it, picking up a little bit more from the sides, as you know the dough is gonna tolerate it. We're just doing this, say 30 seconds to a minute, until you've formed a beautiful, cohesive ball of dough. We're gonna let these rest for about 20 minutes uncovered, and then I'll be right back. In the 20 minutes it took for my loaves to bench rest, I went ahead and prepared my 2 proofing baskets. These are really helpful to have, but if you don't have them, you can always use just a large ceramic bowl of some kind, but you definitely want to line it with either a tea towel or parchment like I have done. Lately, I found parchment to work best. As you can see, you just want to make sure it's really, really well floured. That's going to be the most important thing about this, because if your dough sticks to your towel, to your parchment, and I found the parchment to be a little better when it comes to sticking, it can kind of undo all the hard work that you've put into shaping those loaves, building the surface tension, because it will just collapse when you try to pull it off. But what we're gonna do now is just repeat that shaping process from before to continue to build that surface tension. I'm gonna nestle these little beauties into their proofing baskets, and they are gonna sit for about 2 hours, up to 4 hours, just based on my kitchen. Again, one of the biggest things you can take away from all of this is to kind of take these times with a grain of salt, because it's all going to depend on your kitchen, on your sourdough starter. Again, the sourdough starter, it's a living thing. The yeast is living. It doesn't have a brain, obviously, but in a way it kind of has a mind of its own. So just bear that in mind when you're thinking about times. Anyway, back to shaping these loaves, literally repeating the exact same process from before. When it comes time to put your dough into the proofing basket, after it's super well floured, you can even kind of roll it around on some flour itself before setting it in. You want to put the pretty side, the smooth side, down. Uneven side is facing up. Here's one. We're gonna cover these up, put them in a warm, cozy place for a couple hours. And I just wanna show you ahead of time kind of how big the loaves are so you have a point of comparison when we see the end result. My loaves have been proofing for about 2 hours, and I know I'm about 1 hour away from baking, so I'm gonna go ahead and preheat my oven itself as well as my Dutch oven inside it. I'm taking it to about 525 or 550 degrees, which is as hot as my oven can get without officially broiling. And again, you wanna let it heat for at least 30 minutes minimum, but ideally closer to an hour. And getting this cast iron or whatever sort of Dutch oven you have nice and hot is gonna ensure that you get a beautiful oven spring, because the heat in the pot itself, in the pan itself, is going to make all the water come out of the bread. Essentially, when it gets in the oven, as soon as it gets in the pot, that steam creates our oven spring. Our bread is done proofing, our oven is preheated, and it is time to bake. I'm gonna bake one of these loaves now with you and just save the other in the fridge for after we've already dug in to the first one. But there's one more thing we need to do before it hits the oven. So first we're gonna take it out of the proofing basket. I like to just turn it over into my hand to work quickly but gently to remove the parchment. Something I found to help with sticking is you can put it in the refrigerator for the last hour or so of your second proof, even if you don't refrigerate it the whole time, and that will help it kind of firm up a little bit and prevent it from sticking. But we're gonna go ahead and score the bread. I have a little razor blade here just on a device that makes it easier to hold without getting poked. I found this on Amazon as well. Highly recommend you investing in one. You can do all kinds of fancy things with this, but my dough is already soft enough that I'm just gonna do about 3 little lines. And it should puff up to something beautiful. So we're gonna pull the cast iron out of the oven, set this in, and it'll bake. We're gonna cover the sourdough back up, put it in the oven. We're baking it for 20 minutes, covered. Again, at about 525, even 550 degrees. After 20 minutes, we're going to remove the lid from the bread. This is when we get to see the beautiful oven spring, but I'm making y'all wait till the very end. And we're gonna reduce the temperature to 450 degrees for 15 more minutes. Oh my goodness. Well, here it is, y'all, our end result. We've got a beautiful golden crispy crust. Got some good oven spring. It's not quite as tall as it probably would have been had it not stuck to my hand, but I know it's gonna have a beautiful interior. It's gonna be absolutely delicious. I will insert a clip of the interior here. Once I cut into it, it's still pretty hot. But yeah, I mean, that's the long and short of it. I hope this video is helpful to you and to the point, while still giving you that necessary detail. Please let me know in the comments what other sorts of either sourdough videos or baking videos more broadly you would like to see. Don't forget to like this video if you liked what you saw, if it was helpful to you, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Until next time, bye y'all.